We are recording. We are good. I just got to get my screen share back up. There we go. Before I get going, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on the River Rising Solutions webcast. I'm Shannon Blankenship, Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, joined by my co-host, virtually Jimmy Orth, Executive Director. Today on episode 6 of the River Rising Solutions webcast, we're discussing the need for climate justice in order to achieve meaningful climate solutions. We'll be joined by Salome Garcia of the CLEO Institute, the Policy and Campaigns Manager. Today, we're going to cover the need to rethink climate policy issues by environmental organizations. We'll then have our guest speaker join us to walk through how the CLEO Institute is working on this issue directly. And last, we will end with viewer comments and questions, so stay tuned if you want to participate. But Jimmy, first I want to turn it over to you so that you can help us and our members understand how this conversation helps us to fulfill our mission to defend and protect the St. Johns River.
Yeah, if any of you are not familiar with St. John's Riverkeeper, we are essentially a watchdog group for the St. John's. We are a nonprofit advocacy organization that our mission is to protect and defend the St. John's. And so we do that in many ways. We advocate for policy solutions, as we're going to talk a little bit about today. But we also do it through trying to hold polluters accountable, our regulatory agencies, working with them to make sure that they're actually implementing the laws and enforcing our laws. And we do it through education and outreach. We do a lot in the community, in the schools, but also with adult populations to try to educate and empower people to become more involved in our advocacy work. This series actually started because we had been involved, as many of you who are on the call on the show today may remember. We've been involved with the dredging issue, the issue to dredge the St. John's for many of years. And one of the concerns of dredging is that it will increase the water levels from storm surge in the river, as well as increasing it during high frequency storms potentially as well. And so we approached it from that angle. We were really concerned that after Hurricane Irma, it was really an eye-opener of how vulnerable the community really is to potential flooding, and especially how important inches are in terms of inches really do matter. I know the Army Corps kind of discounted the fact that the few inches that they had projected of increase would not matter. But what we saw in Irma is they truly do matter, especially in low-lying communities like in the Jacksonville area. So we got more involved and concerned about this and started a River Rising series to let people know not only about the impacts of dredging, but also the impacts of rising waters from climate change in the St. Johns River and what those impacts mean to the river. Of course, we are concerned about property and lives, of course, but also about the impacts to the St. Johns itself. When we see these flooding events, they're essentially unmitigated pollution events. That pollution flows into the St. Johns River and contaminates the river. And we also see a lot of sewage overflows when that happens as well. So it's a health risk when we have these type of incidents occur, but it's also a pollution problem that can impact the health of the St. Johns River. I think what we also realized through this is how it really does impact people, and environmental damage that we do in terms of climate change and pollution that we put into our environment really it's a people issue as well. Sometimes we lose sight of that, and I know we're going to talk more about that today.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. And today we're discussing the need to potentially rethink how many environmental organizations have been approaching climate change and other environmental issues really for the last 100 years. For decades, as more and more destruction of natural places has occurred, environmental advocates for these beautiful, wild, and meaningful places and the wildlife within them have organized in order to defend and protect. But with a focus on the health of the natural world, most organizations have ignored the fact that being an environmental advocate often requires a certain degree of privilege. Financial freedom, education, and white privilege have afforded environmental groups the ability to grow and sustain themselves, all while injustices against people have persisted. So while it is so important to recognize, it's also the very same forces that impact our air, land, and water that are impacting people, and disproportionately, that are impacting people of color and economically vulnerable communities. Climate change is perhaps the most important issue that many of us will face in our lifetimes, and it won't be solved by traditional approaches of environmental groups. Solutions to climate change must also address systematic injustices confronting frontline communities that are already dealing with these issues firsthand. So today we're going to discuss these issues and how climate justice is needed for climate solutions with our guest. But first, Jimmy, maybe you could help expand on this idea that climate change, in order to discuss solutions, it will require a broader network of environmental advocates.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because as somebody who's been involved in environmental advocacy for, gosh, it's been 30 years now, I have seen firsthand over the years about how we have been a predominantly white and predominantly middle to middle upper class movement. And what we've done in that process is excluded a lot of people from this process. One that can help. I mean, I think that's something we got to realize is people that have a stake in this and can be a part of this movement. But also we've excluded a lot of people who are disproportionately affected by the impacts of the environmental damage that we've done on the country and pollution. And so I think that's the thing that we've really missed over the years. I think historically, environmental groups have focused on it and seen environmental issues as a separate issue from social issues. And I actually went last year to a conference that was a youth climate summit that was held in Miami. And I remember listening to a Reverend Yearwood, and he said, listen, we can no longer try to solve these problems in silos. We can't look at it as an environmental. He said, or a social issue. We can solve poverty and we can solve environmental problems at the same time, and we should. And so it really opened my eyes to the opportunities too that this presents for us to work together with marginalized communities, and also the obligation that frankly we have to address those concerns. I'll leave you with one quote that I really like from Robert Bullard, Dr. Bullard, who's considered the father of environmental justice. He actually said when working with a community in Houston that was trying to develop a resiliency plan, he said, listen, you cannot be green if you're not also brown. And I think that's something that we have to realize, that we really need to open our arms and welcome more of these folks into the fold, and also to really make sure that we're addressing their needs as well as the needs of our environment, because they really are one and the same.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I think with that, I want to bring in our guest today. Salome Garcia is the Policy and Campaigns Manager for the CLEO Institute, a Latinx-led nonprofit that drives climate action through community education and engagement. Before joining CLEO, Salome worked alongside Food and Water Watch, Oceana, and the Miami Climate Alliance, leading environmental policy and advocacy work focusing on oil and gas development and climate equity. She has a graduate certificate in climate change and health from Yale School of Public Health, a bachelor's degree in international relations and environmental policy, and is currently a doctoral candidate at FSU's School of Law focusing on international climate law. So with that, Salome, will you share your story with us and help us understand how you decided to become a climate justice advocate?
Sure. Thank you so much, Shannon, for the opportunity to join the St. John's River Keepers, and Jimmy, thank you so much for co-hosting. And so whenever I talk about climate justice or environmental justice, I really enjoy telling my personal story. So I moved to Miami, is where I grew up. I moved to Miami at the age of 6 from Colombia. And, you know, when I moved to Miami or to the United States from Bogota, which is where I was born, I was completely ignorant to what that meant and the changes that that was going to mean to me in my life. When I grew up in Hialeah, which for those of you that don't know is inside of Miami, and it's actually one of the lowest income immigrant communities in the country. And like most in Hialeah, my mom was working 3 jobs in order to support me and my sister. I actually got a job at 13, helping my mom in her cantina business. And, you know, when I was growing up in Hialeah, we didn't have any time to, I'm sorry, let me mute this. We didn't have any time to think about climate change. I didn't have any time to think about penguins and ice cubes because we were just trying to put food on the table. And a lot of the time, my mom especially didn't even have time to be civically engaged. She didn't know who the local candidates were. She barely even knew who the state and federal candidates were. The legal challenges and the economic and financial challenges that came with getting legal status and citizenship were extremely vast. The thousands of dollars needed to even apply for citizenship meant that a lot of my close neighbors and friends didn't see their immigration applications go through. My mom had to get over $25,000 in debt for, you know, to apply for legal status and citizenship status. And as soon as I did finally get citizenship status and I was able to get a full-time job and able to apply to college, I knew that this was my opportunity for my family to have a better life. I got to college and I applied for my first paid internship which was with, some of you might know them, the Climate Reality Project. And when I started working for the Climate Reality Project as an intern during my undergrad, I fell in love with the climate movement. I was like, wow, this is so cool. Climate change is actually important. And when I started to get my mom involved, I quickly realized that all of the materials were in English. And so even though my mom wanted to get engaged and my neighbors wanted to get engaged, these materials were inaccessible to them. And so I took it upon myself to start an organization on campus to translate all of the materials to Spanish. And we actually started doing mini field trips to the Keys National Marine Sanctuary, where I would take a bunch of elementary and middle school students with their moms, predominantly in Hialeah, Florida, were single mothers, head of household that only spoke Spanish. And we would do Spanish field trips to educate students on the importance of environmental stewardship. And these are students that, while they lived 30 minutes away from the beach, had never seen the coastline. And then I got recognized as FIU's, which is my undergraduate institution's leading environmental activist. And I got flown off to DC to meet President Obama and to sit at a round table with then EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy to discuss how local communities and specifically American campuses were acting on climate change. Obviously, I was this young environmental activist, so I was so enthralled to meet President Obama and Gina McCarthy, but I quickly realized, even in Obama's administrations, that I was oftentimes the only woman of color in the room. And that a lot of these solutions, that it was mainly university presidents that were in the room, which were a lot of older white men, and that a lot of the solutions that people were talking about weren't really realistic for my mom. And they weren't really going to be realistic for the neighbors in my community. And so that's really what started to get me thinking about how, even though frontline community residents and people of color and people facing poverty were always at the conversation, we were often not in the room, let alone at the table, having these discussions on these solutions. And that's when I realized that I really wanted to focus on not just talking about frontline communities, but making sure that when discussing the solutions to the climate crisis, we were making sure that we were empowering frontline community residents and bringing them to the table. And I I was able to really kind of grow in this area of interest and dive deeply when I got this job at the CLEO Institute. The CLEO Institute was the first organization that I started to work with, and the Miami Climate Alliance, but the CLEO Institute is a founder of the Miami Climate Alliance, that really provided me with the freedom and the flexibility and the opportunities to say, okay, what do you think needs to get done? How do we empower and provide resources and tools to communities like the one you grew up in and every other community that is a frontline community to bring them at the table and have frontline community residents tell us what solutions they'd like and then provide the tools and resources for them to implement their own solutions.
Salome, can I ask, for folks that don't know, how do you define a frontline community? And it sounds like CLEO specifically works in frontline communities. How do you guys do that? How do you prioritize that work?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. I do think that people and organizations define frontline communities a little different. So I can't tell you the whole, everybody thinks of it the same way, but I can tell you the way that I view it and the way that the CLEO Institute views it. A frontline community is defined by a community that is disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis and also by the transition away from the fossil fuel industry and towards clean and renewable energy. A frontline community changes depending on the geographic area, depending on the country. In fact, Jacksonville is a frontline community because Jacksonville is disproportionately impacted by things like sea level rise. So oftentimes when we think of frontline communities, we often think of people of color, and that may be true countrywide, but here in Florida and in South Florida, it's many white Hispanic residents that are disproportionately impacted. In some areas of Colorado, it can be suburban communities that are all white. However, their jobs depend on coal jobs. So coal dependent families are frontline communities that would be disproportionately impacted when transitioning away from coal. So it depends on which areas you're speaking about, but it's any community that's disproportionately impacted. Oh, and the second question, sorry, the way that CLEO works with frontline communities. So I've been learning, and I think it's an ongoing learning process because frontline communities is so fluid and such a flexible term. But the biggest key is that the CLEO Institute is not a whole encompassing climate justice group, and we don't pretend to be. What working hand in hand with frontline communities really means is making sure that we're prioritizing the local groups that have been working on key issues for decades or for years before the CLEO Institute entered a community. So in every area, it looks different, and it's by reaching out to local groups and uplifting the issues that local groups really care about. Here in Florida, specifically in the North Florida area, a lot of the times that looks in the terms of faith institutions. Faith organizations, youth organizations, and women-led organizations like the WCA, the YMCA, typically have a demographic of people that is unengaged with climate issues, that have other more financial burdens or other burdens that they're talking about or worried about. And we work with them to empower, provide tools, resources, whether that be financial or in capacity or in expertise, and seeing how can we help you. And also, here's some additional educational material regarding how climate change deals with these issues that you're already confronting.
So speaking to that, because I think this is important, how do you talk about climate with frontline communities, and especially in thinking about your mom and when you know that it's not a top of mind issue? How do you approach discussing issues like climate change?
That's a fantastic question. And I think it's especially important in areas of North Florida where a lot of people, the words climate change seems to be a politicized issue. And in a lot of areas where science-based information has been politicized, we at the CLEO Institute get to talk about the impacts of the climate crisis without ever talking about climate change. It's important to talk about climate change and make those connections when you are already working alongside frontline communities on the impacts. So you can talk to community residents about sea level rise, extreme heat, the need for public transportation, the benefits of energy freedom without talking about climate change. And once you provide that education, those tools and resources for local residents to organically engage with the need for financial freedom and with the need for trees to protect from extreme heat, or with the need for access to more public transportation, then you can say, oh, also, this has to do with climate change because of extreme heat. You will find that a lot of the most significant impacts of the climate crisis are really due to extreme heat at the end of the day. And there's very little people in Florida that'll say, no, hot, it's not hot in Florida. Sea level rise, that's a lie. It's not. That is really across the border issue.
We don't need a lot of data to tell people that it's hot here. You're right. I think that's well put.
One of the things too, Salome, that I think is, I'm sure you can elaborate on, but it seems like part of the problem I think environmental groups historically have done is kind of come rushing in to these communities and say, we're here to save the day. And I think it goes to the point of what you were just saying, is that you have to address their needs first and talk to them. And I'll give an example. I remember years ago when I was involved with the Sierra Club here in Jacksonville, I had learned about a Reverend Zach Light, who was a pastor up in Brunswick, Georgia. And actually Brunswick, Georgia at the time had more Superfund sites per zip code than any other community in the country. And they were being, the folks that lived there, which were predominantly African-American, were being exposed to significant amounts of dioxin. And so they saw cancer rates were, in clusters. So I brought Zach down. He'd been fighting against dioxin for some time and brought him to our meeting to speak. And I remember he looked out, he was a very big, imposing man. And he looked out at everybody and he just kind of surveyed the room with a real stern look. And he said, I want you to know, I love all of you, but I don't trust you. And it was a powerful moment. And there was kind of an uncomfortable laugh amongst all the people that were there that happened to be white. But, I think it was so true, because I think the fact is that, yes, he understood we cared about the environment, but I don't know that he truly felt like maybe we cared about him and his community.
Yeah, that really resonates. And I think, it's interesting because I might be totally off base, but I don't think I am when I say that people that care about environmental issues and about climate change issues, we understand that it's not just because trees are pretty. We understand that it's not just because we like to look at the nice lake. People that care about these issues understand that it's more about just pretty trees and lakes. We understand that it's a human issue. But oftentimes when we communicate it, we say, we need to talk about environmental issues. And I feel very strongly within the CLEO Institute that we need to redefine climate change. Climate change is so much more than an environmental issue. It's a human issue, right? It's a rights issue. It's a livability issue. It's a public health issue. So when we talk about working with frontline communities about issues that matter to them, I think, I used to think I was unique, and now I know I'm not. People that are passionate about environmental and climate change issues, you could talk about anything that's wrong with our communities, and we can pinpoint it back to how that issue is exacerbated by the climate crisis. So it doesn't really take a huge leap on a cartwheel to get there. It's just like, what do you care about? Let me work with you on that. And why am I working on it? Because of its correlation.
Well, that's super true. It really, it's the definition, right, of today's webcast. But it's a point I hope that we hit home, like in every single thing that we're talking about today. It's that, climate solutions require climate justice. Like, we cannot talk about climate change and climate science and climate crisis without just bringing more people into the solutions discussion. And if we continue to try and make it just about the environment and the land and the changes that we're all experiencing without relating it to how people are experiencing those changes, then, we're going to lose, I think, the capacity to have the larger voice that we really need in order to have lasting, climate change solutions. Now, I know it's a bit of a transition, but in every single time, at least recently, every single time climate justice is brought up, this term of intersectional environmentalism comes up. And I think a lot of us that have been doing this work for a long time have just really haven't been using that term. And so can you define it for us in the way that CLEO does? And then maybe we'll continue to see it, identify it, and try and live it. I think that's the point, like try and integrate the concept into our work.
Yeah, definitely. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that intersectional environmentalism is something I'm very passionate about, but also it's really a new term for something that the climate justice movements have been doing for very long. And I like to say that we have a messaging problem, and the intersectional environmentalism encaptures that message in a quite lovely way, which is that a lot of the impact, a lot of the causes of environmental harm and harm to our planet are also harming our people. And so intersectional environmentalism is all about how we are prioritizing both people and the planet. And especially it is uplifting how marginalized and underrepresented communities are getting disproportionately impacted. And so I'm going to define it, and I'm going to also copy a link and post it on the chat because it's quite a new website that has recently spurred, and it defines it very lovely there. And that's the definition that I use for a lot of my work. But it also has an incredible amount of resources, educational material, content that people can share. So the intersectional environmentalism definition is as follows. It is an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. It identifies the ways in which injustices are happening to marginalized communities and the earth are interconnected. And it brings injustices done to the most vulnerable communities in the earth to the forefront, does not minimize or silence social inequality. Intersectional environmentalism advocates for justice for people and the planet. So it's not one or the other. It's really about highlighting that interconnectivity, and specifically to uplift the injustices and how some people and some communities have the ability to adapt quicker and more easily.
I think too, that's beautiful. And I think, you know, the interesting thing is just even on the surface, I think sometimes environmentalists, like we focused, as you mentioned before, we focus so much on the health of the environment without realizing that our own health is so interconnected and so dependent upon a healthy environment. In fact, I've often argued that it's really not the earth that's most vulnerable, it's us. Because the earth doesn't need us. The earth can continue and actually potentially thrive if we were not here on the planet. But it's the opposite for us, that if we have a degraded planet, we, the human beings, will no longer exist at some point. And so I think we're the ones that are most vulnerable, and that we should be looking out for that. And we should be looking out for our fellow human beings to make sure that we can thrive together.
You know, I'm curious with your work, with the focus of CLEO, you know, what do you see next on the horizon? What are sort of, I guess, the big mountains that you're looking to climb and tackle and help us relate it to what's going on with the climate discussion?
That's a really great question. And, you know, I'm still trying to figure it out every day as we go. I think that for one, we are Florida focused. I love Florida. The CLEO Institute was founded in Miami over a decade ago. And something that I've realized is that South Florida, which is where we were founded, has organizations that have a big emphasis on the social justice component of environmentalism. And because of that, the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County get pressured and educated constantly on that intersectionality between social justice, racial justice, and environmental issues. However, I have seen a gap or a lack of environmental, climate, and energy groups that have a grassroots social justice and equity lens in areas such as North Florida, the Panhandle, the Tampa Bay area. And so one of the things that I'm very passionate about and that I've been working on very heavily within the past 6 months, which goes back to why I'm speaking here today, is because if there's anything that I would really love to do is I would love to teach people about the tools and the resources and the decade of expertise that the CLEO Institute has accumulated over the past decade and provided to those frontline community organizations across the state that have been working on social justice issues, that have been working on public health, have been working on domestic violence, on heat illnesses, on pollution illnesses, and provide them with those tools and resources and connect those dots. Or there are many organizations that focus on resiliency, on sea level rise issues, on development and what does smart green infrastructure mean, and really bring it home to we're not working on different issues. We're all working on the same issues. And if we can just work together under the biggest existential threat of our time, which is the climate crisis, we would be so much more effective and we would be doing it in a more equitable way. So for the CLEO Institute, my number one priority has been doing these kinds of speaking engagements and building those grassroots networks and relationships across the state that will allow us to support local communities and help them be more effective and maybe connect them to other local organizations that are doing similar work, but kind of separately.
Well, thank you for that. I feel like you just sort of said the words that that we've been saying in our staff meetings for like the last year when it comes to climate change issues, which is just, it's not climate change, it's not climate crisis, it's not sea level rise or green infrastructure or resiliency. It's how do we get as many people all aligned, you know, for this topic and in this way so that we're moving forward and using the momentum of the masses for something that I feel like in truth we're all aligned on, but it doesn't feel like we have the strength in numbers. And I would completely agree with you when it comes to certain communities, Jacksonville specifically, Northeast Florida, but other parts of Florida, you know, we can look to so many other communities and say, they're leading the way. Like, how did they do it? And how do we learn from them? And so again, that's why you're here today, but that's why we wanted you to be here today, right? Because we do want your expertise and we want to learn from you. And really just, we want to see the coalition building the strength in diverse perspectives on what is, a singular threat facing all of us in the same way.
Thank you so
I'll
much.
mention too that just because I think it's a good opportunity to mention that this year, many of you may not realize that earlier in the year, a group came together really informally to decide how can we work together. Now, we weren't the most diverse group of people, but we did represent a lot of different organizations in town, including St. John's Riverkeeper. And we are becoming more of a formalized group now. It is now, I think the new name is going to be Resilient Jacks. Even though it's Resilient Jacks, we're still recognized in the description and our principles that we've identified as an organization that environmental injustice is something that must be addressed and that we must, as a coalition, must address. And so just so you'll know that there is something forming, we're still kind of in our infancy stage and trying to figure out how to build this organization and do it in the right way that's inclusive. And so we're not there yet, but it is, I think, a first step in Jacksonville because we've really never had an organization, a coalition of groups come together like this, and also at the same time address the injustices of environment, of pollution and climate change. And I'll say too that also the city of Jacksonville has come a long way in just the last 2 years. You weren't even hearing anybody talk about climate change hardly or resiliency 2 years ago. And now we have our city council has formed a resiliency committee and has several subcommittees. And all of those committees, several of the members on each one have brought up the importance of equity and of justice and making sure that these solutions that we're trying to apply in terms of resiliency are done in an equitable and just way, and that communities of color and marginalized communities are not left out of the solution. So I'm real proud of Jacksonville because I'm a native of Jacksonville, and I've seen us, it's taken a long time for us to get to this point, but I feel like there's progress, which is great. And we can certainly benefit from the experiences and expertise of people like yourself, help us to continue to grow and to do this more effectively, frankly.
Yeah, I'll say on behalf of the coalition of organizations here in Jacksonville working on resiliency issues, which is soon to be announced known as Resilient Jacks, we brought in the Miami Climate Alliance early on as a model, as someone that we wanted to see how they did it because they are successful and they are doing great work. And so, would love to figure out how to do work like that. And it's because of the inclusivity that is the foundation of their work and CLEO. So thank you for being a founding member of Miami Climate Alliance and really, again, laying the groundwork for, I think that the essence of what we're talking about is that the foundation of your work has to be inclusive of not just the founders and the folks that sustain you, but the people impacted in our communities and bringing everyone to the table. And it's just a matter of, for those of us that have been around and doing this for decades, going back and trying to figure out how to fix that foundation and fill those cracks, I think is where we're many organizations are trying to figure out where to go. And I think CLEO is, you guys are giving us some really great expertise in this field. What do you think that we all need to be doing now, right? To, again, grow and grow the response to climate change for the solutions that we want to see moving forward?
That's a great question. And I think the way that I'm going to answer this question, I'm also going to uplift David's point he just wrote on the chat. Because David's absolutely right. There's no one magic bullet. And I was actually the first staff member with the Miami Climate Alliance. I was the outreach and coalition coordinator. And it was a heck of a job. And I think that it goes back to like, what can we be doing in Jacksonville? The answer to that is that the Miami Climate Alliance is not an organization. It's not even really a formal coalition. What the Miami Climate Alliance did well is that they went out of their way to reach out to frontline community organizations that would have never engaged on climate issues. Some of the foundational members of the Miami Climate Alliance were affordable housing groups. They were women leadership development organizations. They were racial justice organizations. And then when approaching different groups outside of your regular environmental or climate or resiliency group, the conversation where you approach these types of organizations has to be, how can we help you? How can we provide you with help within our own resources and capacity, of course, but it's really doing a capacity analysis of like, what type of tools or resources or expertise, what type of experience do we have? What type of, if funding, if any, but that's, harder to come by. But what are the things that the already existing bought in members of the coalition or members of the organization can give? And then how can we approach groups and say, how can we help? And then also, we're better together. We can uplift your issue if we work together in this other organization who at the end of the day is also trying to uplift affordable housing, is also trying to uplift these other issues. And so that's why when you go to the Miami Climate Alliance website, you don't really see like, we work on climate. Like, no, we work on affordable housing. We work on like public health. We work on like a bunch of other things because those are the foundational ethics and beliefs and morals of the founders. So I think it's all about like shifting how do we approach new members with like, oh, how can we help? And then also making sure that you're absolutely right, kind of looking back and seeing what are some of those foundational gaps that created organizations that, didn't have a lot of color within our leadership. And I love that vision without implementation is, not a reality, right? Because that's really true. And that's why a capacity analysis is so important. It's just like taking a beat and saying, what can we give? What do we have the capacity to, how do we have the capacity to help other groups? And entering with that first step. I hope that, was a good answer. Let me know if I can clarify.
No, that's perfect. I do want to open it up to if there are audience questions for Salome, you're welcome to type them into the chat here. And really just want to, this is an important conversation. It's one that, again, a lot of people are having, but I don't think with enough specificity, right? For like, what do we need to be doing and what do we need to be doing right now? So I just want to thank you for taking the time to be specific and to challenge us. And hopefully this will help more than just St. John's Riverkeeper, but a lot of groups that are saying, I've been working on climate change issues now for 5 years and I can't get traction on this. I can't get elected leaders to listen. I can't get, more than 12 people out to my meetings. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir every time I do this. I think that many groups are having that issue. And so this is a new way to think about it, a new way to approach it. And I think you've given us all some good first steps. I'll take one more minute here to see if we have any questions in the group chat. And I just wanted to apologize to anyone on Facebook Live. I'm not moderating the Facebook page for questions, so I'm looking at my Zoom screen now. Salome, do you have any final thoughts for us before we finish our presentation today?
Sure. Please know that you can count on the CLEO Institute for those tools, resources, partnership help. We do Climate 101s. And I love to do Climate 101s. And what a Climate 101 really is we empower residents to be able to communicate the science, the impacts, and most importantly, the solutions to the climate crisis. And we alter those Climate 101s. We give those to members of the press, members of Congress, local elected officials, and just about any type of organization and business. And we do those completely for free. And if you're representing another group and you would like maybe some help, some strategy help or communications help or whatever the case may be, please look for us as an ally. We're happy to help in any way that we can.
Tune in to episode 7 on August 28th, where we will be discussing how cities are solving climate change with our guest, Chris Castro, Director of Office and Sustainability in the City of Orlando. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Salome, for joining us today, and we hope to see you all soon.
Have a really great day. Bye, everyone.